Answering the question of meaning is a very complicated task, regardless of the worldview. It can be broad and profound in its reach as well as being difficult to articulate. But that should not discourage us from continuing to ask some basic questions about how a particular worldview answers the question of meaning. What is the ultimate purpose in life? What determines individual identity? What does it mean to be satisfied? What values are most important? What is the nature of truth? Michael Ramsden's lecture this week is called The Ontological Root of the Gospel. Ontological refers to the nature of being. In other words, this lecture explains what it means that the Christian faith impacts not simply behavior or belief, but the essence of a person.
Of all the struggles that we've had in our current culture and in the last few years, this struggle with the question of identity is maybe one of the most interesting and also one of the most startling. In years gone by, we had labels sewn into the inside of our clothes to remind us where we bought them and to tell us where to wash them and how to wash them. Now we have the labels on the outside of our clothes to try to define who we are and for us to help construct an image for ourselves. And this question of how we define who we are is one we are searching for answers to, and whether we employ history or geography or maybe family or the culture that we find ourselves in, we're trying to build and construct an answer to the question, who am I? Now, I spent a lot of my childhood growing up in the Middle East, and I can remember when I finally moved to Cyprus, having lived in the United Arab Emirates and then in Saudi Arabia. The question, who am I, was a prevalent one in my mind. And what I began to do was I began to live in a certain way to try to create an identity, to become the person I felt that I always should be. And I watched a large amount of film, and so I began to act like my film heroes that I had seen. One actor who I enjoyed and indeed watched all of his films, who produced an amazing body of work and amazingly never won an Oscar for it, a man by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger. One of his films starts with him walking up a mountain, carrying a tree on his shoulder and smoking a cigar. And since I don't have the build or the inclination to carry trees, the only part of the image I could appropriate to myself was that of smoking cigars. So I used to smoke Cuban cigars because I thought that made me look cool. And actually, all of my image, all of my creativity, everything I had was really poured into trying to realize that particular image in my life. I wanted to be cool. Another one of my heroes was James Bond. James Bond had a silver cigarette case. I too had a silver cigarette case with my initials engraved in the bottom right-hand corner. I used to smoke filterless French cigarettes because you could take one, flick it in the air, catch it in your mouth, and it didn't matter which end you caught, you could always light the other end. Now, this is all completely true. I all used to do this, but if you look at a box of matches, you'll see there's normally a little strip on it, which you strike the match against in order to light it. Well, I used to remove that strip and stick it to the bottom of my shoe. So having flicked a cigarette into my mouth, I could take a match, light it on the bottom of my shoe, just like I'd seen done in the Westerns. Now, the inspiration behind that whole routine was actually from a man called Clint Eastwood, who, for me, was the epitome of coolness. There was no one cooler than him. And there's a story of him being interviewed once, and the interviewer said to him, "Mr. Eastwood, why does everybody think you're such a cool person?" And he took a small cigarillo out of his breast pocket, put it on a table, flicked it so it started spinning in the air. While it was spinning in the air, he produced a match from his back pocket, struck it under the table, caught the cigar, lit it, inhaled very deeply, blew one big smoke ring, 3 little smoke rings through the big smoke ring, and said, "I don't know." Now, all of us are trying to create an image for ourselves, and we're struggling to answer that question. And maybe because of our struggle with that particular question, we sometimes think that Jesus Christ was also struggling with his own identity and had to create one as well. But what we will see within the Christian gospel is that not only does it have a unique way of dealing with this question of identity, but it also has a very unique way in terms of defining what the Christian faith is all about. Now, if you take any religious or philosophical system, you will see that it is rooted or grounded in one of 3 ways. It is either rooted or grounded in thinking, or in feeling, or in doing. Now, systems which are rooted or grounded in thinking say, look, what you need to do is you need to master these thoughts, become conversant with these ideas. And if you do, these will give you the tools to understand life, the universe, and everything else. And the Greeks in particular elevated, the ancient Greeks certainly, elevated the pursuit of thinking as the ultimate tool to help you answer these questions and put it right at the center of everything else. Now, systems which are rooted in feeling tell you to engage with the mystical, to reach out with your feelings, to have some kind of experience in life that will help define and make sense of everything else. And systems which are rooted in doing are very pragmatic. Live this way, do these things, put these principles into effect. If you do, you'll finally have the answers to the questions about who you are, why you're here, and understand your place in the universe and this world, and everything else will fall into order. Now, what is interesting is that in the Christian faith can't simply be reduced into a system of thought to be mastered, even though there's nothing more profound than coming to know the person of Jesus Christ. It can't be reduced into a feeling, even though there's nothing more life-changing than meeting the person of Jesus Christ. And it can't be reduced into a list of do's and don'ts, even though Jesus Christ himself said that Christians should be known for what they do. And this is because the Christian faith is more than these things. It includes these things, but it is more than these things, and even these three things put together. Now, some worldviews, like philosophical Hinduism and various other religious systems, will try to combine the thinking, the feeling, and the doing together. And so it's a combination. Look, think this, do this, experience that. And if you put all of that together, that combines together to give you the answer you're looking for. But the Christian faith, as I say, can't be reduced into one of those or even a combination of those three things. That is because the Christian faith is ultimately rooted and grounded in categories of being. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, systems of thought are revealed to us in words. My words reveal my thoughts to you. Words are revealed thoughts, which is why for the Christian the word of God is very important. It helps reveal God's thoughts to us that we may begin to think his thoughts after him. And in the beginning of the Gospel of John, we read that the Word has become flesh and dwelt amongst us. So this is now not just talking about ideas communicated to us in the abstract, but communicated in the concrete person of Jesus Christ, who historically existed. Systems which are rooted in feeling are hankering after a dynamism in life, an experience in life that we can have that hopefully will make sense of everything else. But we are told, again, in the Gospel of John, that Jesus Christ defined life in terms of knowing him. He said, "Those who do not know me will not taste life, but those who do know me will not taste death." Jesus Christ is now not defining coming to know him as a moment in life so much as the moment of true life itself. This is when life actually begins. Systems which are rooted pragmatically in doing, do these, live this way. Well, at one point in John 6:28, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Master, what must we do to do the works God requires?" They phrase a question to him in the plural, and Jesus replies in the singular. "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." And they say, no, wait a minute. Our forefathers ate manna in the desert. They had bread from heaven. What will you do? What miracle will you perform in order to justify yourself to us? Now, in asking him to justify himself and asking him how to live, they were looking for a way in which they should live this thing out. In asking him to justify himself, they were searching for a path to truth. At one point, Jesus turned to his disciples and said, "Do you want to leave me also?" And they said, "Master, to whom shall we turn? You have the very words of life." A way to live, a path to truth, and the words of life. And in John 14:6, Jesus Christ said, "I am the way and the truth and the life." I am. Jesus Christ put himself at the center of this system. Jesus Christ did not simply come into this world to give us new thoughts about God, or to give us a new standard to live for God, or to simply give us a new experience of God. Jesus Christ came into this world as God himself. And so what is unique about the Christian faith is although theoretically, although they'll be very reluctant, in Islam, if you were to ask a Muslim, did God have to give this revelation to Muhammad, or could God have given it to anyone? They will be very insistent, no, Muhammad was uniquely gifted as this particular prophet. But if you say, well, theoretically, could God have chosen anyone? Eventually say, well, yes, God could have chosen anyone. In other words, even if we didn't have Muhammad, Islam could still come. The same is true in Buddhism. If you say, well, did it have to be the Buddha? The answer is no, it didn't have to be the Buddha who gave us Buddhism. Theoretically, it could be anybody. but it was him who gave it to us. But again, we can remove Buddha from the system and the system still remains. But you can't remove Christ from Christian. If you try to remove Christ from Christian, you're only left with the letters I-A-N, and Ian cannot help you. Because Jesus Christ didn't simply come to give us a system. He didn't simply come to give us a system about God or a new experience of God or tell us how to live for God. Jesus Christ came as God himself. He said, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. The Christian faith is rooted in being in terms of its incarnation. That's why we use that word. Jesus Christ didn't come to say, well, look, there's God. That's what he is like. He said, if you want to know what God is like, look at me. The Father and I are one. The Christian faith is rooted in being in terms of its salvation. It is through Christ's physical death and bodily resurrection that we are saved. We are told that when Christ went to the cross, he took on into his being everything that had gone wrong in ours. All the wrong thoughts we've ever had, all the harmful experiences, all the bad things that we have ever done, and all of the consequences that flow from all of those things, and all of the punishment it deserves, all of that he took on into himself. He literally took on into his being that which has gone wrong in ours. And it is through his physical death and bodily resurrection that he both pays for that and also conquers over it. It's also rooted in being in terms of it's what we call the new creation, therefore. Now, here's where the message of the Christian gospel is very easily misunderstood, but where also the profundity of it really lies. Christians are not simply saying, look, we need to believe certain ideas only, or we need to live a certain way only, or we need to have certain experiences only. The Christian message of salvation goes deeper than that. It actually says that the problem we ultimately face is actually located within our being, that we as human beings are actually fallen, that something has gone wrong inside of us. And when Jesus Christ comes into this world and makes himself one with us and then goes to the cross, he takes that which has gone wrong in our being into his, and he takes that price. And then through his death and his resurrection, he then comes to us and he gives us new life in him. Literally, we become new creations in him. We are born again. We have this new life, this new birth. We have these new natures that the gospel that we read about in the Gospels and also in the letters. Literally, this comes to change who we are at the most fundamental level. If you walk into any bookshop and you go into the self-help section, you'll find many, many books which are claiming to help change your life, to help you become the person you always thought you should be. And they're normally saying, well, look, you need to change the way you think about certain things, change the way you feel about certain things, change what you actually do. But the Christian faith is more fundamental than that. It actually offers to change who we are. So in all these other religious systems, and indeed in some non-religious systems, they're working from the basis and they're saying, look, you're not happy with who you are. You sense there's something wrong. But if you think this way, if you feel this way, if you live this way, eventually you'll become the person you want to be. But Jesus Christ is offering to start where the others want to finish. He is saying, no, look, come to me and I will make you new. I will give you a new life that is made possible through what I have done and if you become one with me. There's a very well-known neuropsychologist by the name of Oliver Sacks who wrote a book called Awakenings, which was subsequently made into a film with Robert De Niro. And as is the case, the book is normally much more insightful, as brilliant as the film actually is. And fairly early on in that book, Oliver Sacks writes this. He says, all of us have a basic intuitive feeling that once we were whole and well, at ease, at peace, at home in this world, totally united with our being, and that somehow we lost this primal, happy, innocent state and fell into our sickness and suffering. We had something of infinite preciousness and beauty, and we've lost it. We spend our lives searching for that which we have lost, hoping one day we will suddenly find it, and that will be the miracle, the millennium. Now, that is incredible. After 100 years of psychological research, trillions and trillions of dollars spent, and we finally got as far as Genesis chapter 3, that we were created in the image of that which was infinitely precious and beautiful, and that somehow we have lost something, we have fallen away. And this is what the Bible calls the fall. The fundamental problem we face as human beings is not that we need ever sophisticated understanding, ever sophisticated experience, or to be told to live in a whole new way. We need someone who can come in and actually give us a new state of existence, give us new life, give us new birth. And this is exactly what Jesus Christ claims uniquely to be able to do. And interestingly, is not actually the subject of the offer of salvation made in other systems. It's the end product of where you may hopefully eventually get to. Whereas Jesus Christ says, no, this is where you need to start. You start with this new life. And then, of course, the Christian faith is rooted in being in terms of its perpetuation. And so we read in 2 Corinthians, for example, that Christians are living letters known and read by everybody. Literally, that people should be able to look at this new life, read the changes that have been made in it, and then begin to come to the conclusion, well, surely only God could begin to change human hearts like that. Only God could take someone who seemed to be so selfish, or so full of hatred, or so caught up in themselves, or whatever it may be, and turn them around to be this kind of person. And so here is where we find this very interesting misunderstanding that a lot of people have about the Christian faith, and sometimes, sadly, even Christians themselves. As a matter of fact, it may be possible to argue that almost all heresy down through the history of the Christian church has been a reduction of the gospel into only a thought system of thought to be mastered, only an experience that you have, only a way of life to be lived. Whereas actually it is rooted in being, that in the person of Christ, God is revealed. We get to see who he is and what he is like. That in his presence and in his light, the way we are is really revealed, and the way this world is really revealed. And we see the fact that even though we were created in one way, we've fallen away from it and become less than who we are. That through the cross, that this brokenness and this fallenness, this issue is actually dealt with. Christ takes on into him that which has gone wrong in us and in this world, and he now comes to us having conquered over it. Through his resurrection, he offers us new life and the promise of a new world to come where all things will be made new. Now, why is this so important in an apologetics course? Well, the answer is that when people hear apologetics, they sometimes think, and they'll sometimes misunderstand what we're talking to them about as, well, here is an offer of some new thoughts for you, or here's a certain experience it would be nice for you to have, or don't do that, do this. So the Christian faith becomes believing in crazy ideas, having certain types of experiences, promising to do some things and not to do others. And if that is what people are hearing, at that point they have missed out on what the Christian gospel is actually about, because we're not there simply to offer those things, we're offering something much deeper. Now, that also then means that we then have to understand what it means ourselves then to be Christians. Once you have received this new life, this new birth in Christ, then you have to learn how to think as a Christian, how to feel as a Christian, and how to act as a Christian. In other words, we live out that which has now been put within us. Now, if we don't understand that, we then begin to struggle with our own identity as Christians. If you are a Christian, what do you do if you don't understand something? Well, if your identity is wrapped up and defined basically and only on the basis of what you think, when you come across something which you're struggling with, you put a question mark next to it, and therefore you have to put a question mark next to who you are. If you define your Christian identity on the basis of what you feel, then what do you do when God doesn't feel close? Well, you have to put a question mark over your feeling, you have to put a question mark over who you are. If you define Christian faith on the basis of what you do, in terms of your doing, then whenever you fail, you have to put a question mark over that, and then you have to put a question mark over fundamentally about who you are. But if you know who you are in Christ, that you are a son, you are a daughter, he has changed you, you now have this new nature from him, you've now become this new person in him, then it allows you to be honest with where you're struggling with your own questions, where you're struggling in terms of your experience in your walk, or where you're struggling in terms of what you do. If you ask almost any educational psychologist, they'll tell you that children who are comfortable with knowing who they are feel free to ask questions. They tend to learn very well, and they grow up to be emotionally secure and also develop proper patterns of behavior. And so too, when you become a Christian, we have to learn, well, how do we think as a Christian? How do we feel as a Christian? And how do we act as a Christian? Now, sometimes as a church, we're very good at encouraging people to do one of these three things, or maybe sometimes two of these three things. But just like when you were born the first time into an earthly family, you weren't taught how to think properly, how to relate emotionally properly, or how to live properly. So too when you become a Christian, if you're never trained how to think properly or how to relate emotionally to God properly or how to live properly, you'll grow up and you'll sense a sense of imbalance. We need all of these three things together. So the Christian faith is something which is rooted and grounded in this category of being. And it is because we are human beings that we can think, we can feel, and we can do. So don't hear what we're saying here now to say Christianity is not about thinking, not about feeling, not about doing. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is this, and it was beautifully summed up by Athanasius, that everything that is because God ultimately is. In other words, we start with God. God is. God then created everything else. Everything that is created by him. However, when we turned our backs on God and when we rebelled against him, we and this creation fell. We are now fallen. We are less than what we were. Now, the creation cannot recreate itself. Only the Creator can recreate. God spoke through his word the first time to bring everything that is into existence. Now he's spoken a second time through his word made flesh to bring about that work of new creation, that we may become the people that he would have us be. And so we see in the Christian faith, the idea of sin isn't just something which we do. It seems to describe the state which we are actually in, that we are sinful, we are fallen, we're less than we thought. It's amazing that this theme is actually picked up by Mary Shelley in her book Frankenstein, which is a remarkable book and filled with incredibly deep insight. But if you read through that book very carefully, there is a very profound moment where Frankenstein, who is the doctor who has created this being, is confronted by his creation. And the creation that Dr. Frankenstein brings into life into this world is actually a very benign and innocent being. So he's not, Dr. Frankenstein's monster isn't created as a monster at all. It is innocent, gentle, and kind, although slightly on the ugly side. And this being looks at Dr. Frankenstein and says, when I first came into this world, I couldn't understand why human beings needed laws or governments or had police forces. I couldn't understand that. Human beings seemed to be the sheer embodiment of everything that was noble and good and godlike. He says, but then I began to read your history, and then I began to experience you and observe your behavior, and my wonder ceased, says this being, and I turned away in disgust and loathing. Because although at one point you seemed to be everything which was good and godlike, you also seemed to be everything that was vicious and base. And then the monster begins to wonder, how is it possible for human beings at once to have such godlike and noble qualities, such goodness, and also such viciousness and capable of such evil? All I can conclude, says the monster, is you were created in the image of that which is perfect and fallen away from it. Now later the monster goes on to speculate that maybe he was created in the image of something that was imperfect and has fallen away from that, and begins to lose hope that there may be any form of redemption for him whatsoever. But once again we see this theme now being picked up, that somehow we are less than what we should be. There is this conflict within our nature and who we are. And the question is there any way out of that? Can we be changed? And the answer is coming again through Jesus Christ and this promise that he alone is able to change a human heart and he alone is able to change our nature. And so as we now come to think about how we communicate the gospel, let us then be very, very clear that we're not asking people simply to agree with what we say or to invite them to have a certain type of experience or to do some things and not do others. All of those areas must change and will be affected by becoming a Christian. But what we are first and foremost saying is, do you know who Jesus Christ is? Do you know what he became on the cross? Do you see who you are in his light? And have you experienced this new birth that only he can bring? If you have, you now are a Christian. You need to learn how to think, feel, and act as a Christian. And through those avenues, be able to communicate it effectively to others, but not reduce it into those so that people begin to miss what is at the very heart of the gospel itself. Many years ago now for myself, I can remember coming to the realization about who Jesus Christ was in terms of his identity, that he was who he claimed to be. He was the Son of God, that he had become sin for me on the cross and had conquered over sin and death through this resurrection. And I was sure that it was true and it was real. And then the question then was, well, where do I go from here? Well, I was scared, and one of the reasons I was scared was I was sure that if I became a Christian, it would change me. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to be changed, because I was very happy with my life. I had a privilege of money in my background. I had a very stable family. I knew that I was loved. I had a wonderful education. I'd been able to travel quite extensively right from a very early and young age. And I was fairly certain that in the process of becoming a Christian, life would get worse. So if my experience was up here, all of a sudden it will sink all the way down and just drop off the thing, off the scale completely. The incredible fact was that even at the point of becoming a Christian, I was scared that God would change me and life would become worse, was that when I met the person of Christ, not only did he transform my being, but life became so much more than I ever dreamed it was possible to be. And that is the change that is promised in the gospel. And if you're following through this series, when we started off by saying that people should expect to see changed lives and ask us questions, it causes us to once again ask ourselves the question, has our life been changed? What does it say? Do people notice that change in us? Are they asking questions about it? And do they understand that ultimately the Christian gospel is about the person of God revealed in the person of Christ, who he is, how he reveals everything else, and what it can ultimately become in him and through him?